to another conversation series talk for people watching on the stream. I'm Joe Iko, the director of the MIT Media Lab. And if you are on Twitter, you can use the hashtag MLTalks if you want to tweet questions or talk about the talk. Today we have Moran Cerf, who's actually spoken here at the lab before, but we wanted to get him back again on the big stage to share with more people. He's assistant professor of business at Kellogg and assistant professor of neuroscience at the surgical unit of LIJ in New York. He's going to talk about a bunch of stuff, but I'm going to let him surprise you. Welcome, Moran, and welcome to MIT.
Thank you. I have no clock. Usually I see my time, so I'm going to kind of speak. And when I have no clock, I tend to speak very fast when I get excited. So whoever is in the back and feels that it's too fast, just don't hesitate to raise your hand and slow me down. It's going to happen, I'm sure, during the talk. So just don't hesitate. So I'm going to speak today about what I call from neurons to behavior, which is to say that I believe that understanding how the brain works tells us something about behavior. It tells us how we operate. It tells us what our decisions, what our emotions, what our choices and options are in the brain. And actually, understanding how the brain works leads to understanding why we do what we do. So, is it working? We're seeing? I might just speak without a picture. You actually are good without it because the first picture is a picture of the brain that some of you might be not happy to see. Yes, okay, so this is one of 3 pictures of brains I'm going to show in the next half an hour, 40 minutes. If you find this gory, I'm going to try to monitor who you are right now, so I would let you guys know when the next picture of a brain shows up so you would know not to look. Okay. So I believe that looking at the brain is what we need to do in order to understand behavior. And let me first convince you by telling you a story or two about our brains. So judging from the kind of age group that I see in front of me, I imagine that you weren't here in the 60s. But in 1960, this person on the slide became very famous in grave circumstances when he took a cab from his apartment in Austin and he drove to the University of Austin in Texas. He climbed the tallest building in the university, stood up there, pulled an AK-47 and started spraying people below. And he killed 14 people right away. Then he waited for the emergency technicians to show up, and then he shot them and killed them. And then he started killing people one after the other, spraying and reloading his rifle from the top of this building, until after about an hour, the police was able to come to the building and kill him. And then they tried to figure out what would lead a person to do something like that. What would make a man engage in such a awful behavior? So they went to his neighborhood to kind of investigate who he is. And it turns out that this was a classical case of a person that was seemingly great and was awful in hiding. He was a great neighbor. His neighbors claimed that he was mowing the lawns of everyone perfectly. He was discharged honorably from the Marines a few years before. He was very organized, meticulous. All of his clothes were color-coded. He seemed like a great guy. There was no reason for him to behave the way he behaved. And no one knew what could have been the reason until the police looked in his apartment and found under his mattress a little diary that he kept meticulously. And in his diary, he reported changes on his behavior. He said, I feel I'm not myself. I have awful thoughts in my mind. I'm not myself. He goes to a psychiatrist and checks himself to see if they can figure out what's wrong with him. And he gets sent back home. Everyone says he's okay. And he writes in his diary in the few weeks before that he feels any day now something bad is going to happen. And he even says, my brain is not perfect, and if something bad happens to me, and I end up dead, I want the people who find me to run an autopsy on my brain because it's not okay. So the police says, okay, we're going to do that. And they conduct an autopsy on his brain, and he even leaves a check for $30,000 for this autopsy. So they actually do that, and what they see is a massive tumor pressing on the part of the brain that's right in the center of his brain, called the amygdala, that has to do with fear and aggression and may have led to this behavior. We cannot know. But here's a story that we can know a lot about. 10 years ago, 2005, a woman in San Diego calls the police and says, my husband, who I've been married to for a decade, and he had a perfectly normal sexual appetite, became a pedophile. My husband is a pedophile. I don't know what to do. He's making advancements at our 4-year-old daughter. I'm worried about her. You've got to arrest my husband. So they're arresting the husband, and they file child porn. Am I doing something wrong? Oh, moving too fast? So I'm here to speak to you today about behavior from neurons. I'm going to start over. I'm joking. So we're going to continue from where I was.
So the police arrest the husband, and he goes on trial. And as the trial begins, he complains about having headaches. So on day 1, he complains, but no one listens to him. On day 2, he complains, no one listens to him. On day 3, he has a seizure in the courthouse. And now they figure out that something is wrong with him. They take him to the emergency room. They look at his brain. And what they see is a massive tumor pressing on the front part of his brain where decision-making is happening, where choices are happening, and presumably also his decision to behave the way he behaved happened. So now, straight from the emergency room, he goes to the operating room where a surgeon operates on his brain and removes this massive tumor from his brain. And when he wakes up from the surgery and recovers, not only is he no longer having a tumor in his head, he also goes back to his normal sexual appetite. He is no longer a pedophile. So instead of being sent to prison, he's sent back home on probation. And the story is already interesting by itself because this man changed his behavior once they changed something in his brain, but actually there's a twist that makes it even more interesting. Because 10 months later, the wife calls again and says, my husband is again a pedophile. He's happening again, I don't know what to do. This time they know what to do. They take him straight to the emergency room, look at his brain, and they see that some residue of the tumor weren't taken out and it grew back. And now they take it out in the second surgery, and again, when he recovers, he's going back to his normal sexual appetite. This is like a controlled experiment. You have it one way, you behave one way, you take it, it behaves differently, you bring it back, you behave differently. So it's like a perfect experiment to show that changes to our brain actually lead to changes in our behavior. Now, you don't have to go that far into experiments like the ones I showed you right now to talk about that. You can also think about yourself. Tonight, after this talk, we might all go to a bar, and we're going to pour a little bit of ethanol on our mucilus glands, and suddenly everything is going to look different. Everyone is going to be funnier and cuter. We're going to find ourselves a lot more amused by things. So we can all imagine how little changes to our brain change our behavior and perception. We can all see how things that happen to us actually lead to different experiences in the world. Now, I got interested in that when I was a kid. When I was a kid in the 80s, computer games were pretty expensive. So the way to play them was to go to a video game store. And I used to play a specific game that I was really good at that for the first time made me realize that actually in our brain, there might be things that are not under my control, and maybe there's more than one person inside my brain who governs who I am. So this game, if you're not familiar with, King Kong is a gorilla sitting up at the top, and you're playing this Italian plumber. Your job is to climb up the ladders, pick this hammer, and break the barrels that the gorilla throws at you on your way to save the princess at the top floor. I was playing this game for about half a minute, doing pretty well. So I was kind of taking the hammer, and I climbed to the second floor, and I was doing pretty well, when suddenly 2 words appear on the screen, and they changed my entire perception of control. The 2 words were insert coin. As it turns out, I wasn't playing the game at all. I was watching a video, a demo of the game, but I felt I was in control. Because I moved to the right sometimes, and the character moved to the right. I pressed the button to jump, and it jumped. Sometimes I tried to move left, and it moved right, or I tried to jump, and it didn't jump. But overall, most of the times, me and the character had the same kind of agenda. We both tried to do the same thing. So because most of the times there was agreement between me and the character, I just assumed that whatever I want is what's happening. And this is an analogy for life. Because it turns out that in life, the same thing happens all the time. We move our bodies in the world. We think that we're in control because most of the things we want are happening. And we just assume that it's probably under our control because we are driving the wagon. I'm going to show you that what I saw in this little demonstration actually happens all the time. We find ourselves in things in the world, and we kind of tell ourselves a story that says that we always wanted to be there. It's kind of what we wanted to be. So the first time I kind of got exposed to it as a scientist was a few years ago when I was in New York, and a study run by a colleague of mine demonstrated nicely that in fact in our brain there's probably more than one person sitting there, and more so, we change the past to listen to the last person in our brain who spoke. So in this study, what was done is a pretty simple experiment where people come to the lab, this was only straight men, and they were asked to make the simplest choice you can imagine, a choice about attraction. So what we do is we show you 2 cards with 2 pictures of women, and we ask you, who do you find more attractive? The easiest choice, right? You don't have to think hard. So the guy in this study maybe says, I think that the woman on the left is more attractive. They'll say, fantastic. We're going to give you a card with the picture that you chose. And you have to explain in one sentence why you picked that card. So we show you 2 cards. You say, I like the one on the right. We give you the card. You hold it in your hand, and you say, I really like her hairstyle. Fantastic. We pull 2 new cards with 2 new pictures. We say, who do you want? For those 2, you say the one on the left. We give you the card. You hold it in your hand, and you say, I really like her smile. And for about 1 hour, we keep choosing 2 pairs of cards, 2 new pairs at each trial. We show you the 2 women, you make a choice, we give it to you, and you say why. This is what you think happens. What really happens is that the guy in the back, the guy who hands you the card, is not just a regular guy, he's a magician that we hired. And in 10% of the trials, in about 10 trials out of the 100 trials, the card it gives you isn't the card you chose. So you chose the one on the right, he gives you the one on the left. First of all, people never notice. People never notice that there was a big change here. You chose A and you got B. And that's already exciting, but it's even more interesting that what happens next is that the person explains to us why the card he received was the card he wanted. Right? You have two options. You choose this one, I give you that one, and you take it, you don't say anything, and you explain to me why this is what you wanted all the time. Meaning you go back in time in your mind and you kind of rewrite history to end up where you are right now. We do it all the time. Imagine our life. We kind of live in the present and we just go back in time and we characterize the story such that it ends up where we are. We justify everything. We synthesize the story of ourselves to end up where we are right now as if we wanted. You can think about this like a marketing thing. Imagine what I want to do in marketing. If I somehow can get some items into your shopping cart and make you arrive at a cashier check with the items that I put there, you're going to not only buy them, you're going to explain to your friends why that's the best item out there, and you're going to actually convince others to buy it. You're going to totally be on board of the things that I put in your cart. So we're going to live life in a way telling the story of the card that we received rather than the card we wanted. Now, if this is true, it means that in our brain there's one person who makes a choice, and a different person who justifies things afterwards, and maybe a third person who thinks and evaluates things. There's more than one people in the brain, and they all live together, and we speak in the voice of the last person who spoke inside our head. And I, as a scientist, always wanted to see if we can actually access those people, if we can somehow see those two people in the brain and see who speaks in different voices. And it turns out that there's many ways to do that, but the first way I learned about is something that was done in the 60s by a person at Caltech called Roger Sperry. He won the Nobel Prize for this study. And he studied people that, just by their name, you can see that they're interesting, called split brain patients. So split brain patients are patients who have a very unique situation. They usually have epilepsy. And epilepsy is a disorder in which some part of your brain starts acting with no provocation. So suddenly, with no reason, a part of your brain starts speaking, and it talks to other parts that start speaking too, and they start speaking like an earthquake in your brain. Suddenly, all of your brain starts acting together. So the entire brain goes into synchronization, and you move your hands uncontrollably, and you lose consciousness, and you fall down, and you shake, and you might hurt yourself or others. So this is a pretty crazy situation that you really have to control perfectly. Right now, we do it by using drugs that kind of suppress the seizures, but in the 60s, one of the ways to stop the seizures was to cut the brain in half. Let me explain to you how it works. What the idea behind it was that if the seizure starts here and it's spread into your brain, if our brain is made of two hemispheres, two sides, and there's a bridge between them that connects them, what we're going to do is we cut the bridge. So the seizure is actually going to stay in one side of the brain, and you have the entire side of the brain left available for you to control things. The seizure is never going to spread all the way to the other side, so you're going to have half your brain to maybe stop the car or drop your baby instead of dropping him on the way in the ground, all kinds of things to help yourself prevent the seizure. So Sperry's innovation was to cut the brain in half to stop the seizures. And as it turns out, if you cut the brain in half, you don't just stop seizures, you also do some things to your behavior. So if you kind of get exposed to the brain for the first time today, what you're going to need to know is that in our brain, there's asymmetry. Everything that happens on the left side of the body is controlled by the right side of the brain and vice versa. So my left hand that I move right now, the control of this left hand comes from the right side of my brain. When I wink with my left eye, it's the right side of the brain that controls the signal. If I do it with the right eye, it's the left side. So there's asymmetry. But what happens with part of the brain we have only one of, like my tongue or my mouth? We have only one. Who controls that? Turns out for that, the brain just chose a side. So biology just said that every part that has to do with language comes from the left, and that's it. It's just asymmetrical in our brain. Also, the part in our brain that solves puzzles sits in one side of the brain. And when these guys, like this person here, a split brain patient, is asked to solve a puzzle, he's going through a very interesting moment. Because what you see right now is that this guy is playing a game where he's seeing a little shape, and he's supposed to use 4 cubes in his left hand to organize the cubes to make this shape. So it takes him very little time, and it's very easy to do with the left hand, because the left hand speaks to the right side of the brain, where puzzle solving sits, so you can do it easily. Now he's told, do the same thing with your right arm. The right arm speaks to the left side of the brain, and because the bridge is split now, he cannot access the part of the brain solved puzzle. So he's unable to do it. The same person, just different hand, he cannot solve the same puzzle. And you see that the left hand actually knows the answer. You'll see in a second that the left hand wants to help the friend because it knows the answer. It's seeing it in front of its eyes. And even more interestingly, when this guy is allowed to use both hands, you actually see the competition in action. You see the two hands vying for dominance. You see how these guy's hands are actually fighting to control his body. One of them knows the answer, the other one doesn't, and they just kind of argue live outside of his brain on control over this puzzle. Now this thing that you see here happens in our brain all the time. At any given moment, there's those characters in your brain that fight over who you are. One of them wins, and you speak in the voice of the one who won as if this was always what you wanted. There's an election happening in your brain, one wins, and you just go back and tell yourself a story as if the winner was always who you were. Now, neuroscientists have been trying to access those people in the brain in many ways. They looked at all kinds of tools that exist out there, from running magnetic fields into your brain, to looking at your skull from the outside, to actually shining light into cells in your brain that's done here. A lot of ways to access the brain, but the ultimate way to study the brain is to look at the brain directly, to open a person's brain and put microphones inside and see how the brain operates. Of course, we cannot do that with humans, so we do it with monkeys and rats and mice and other animals, because who would let you open the brain and put electrodes inside? But with animals, we can actually see exactly how the brains function. And if I wanted to illustrate that, if you can look at this image here, now I need the sound. Okay. Those spikes of activity that you hear, those bursts of activity, this is how one cell in the brain sounds. So if you put a microphone next to one cell, and you listen to it, what you're going to hear are those prr, prr, prr. Those bursts of activity is this cell telling other cells in the brain, whatever happening in the world right now, I care about that. So this is how we know that a cell cares about something. We can see what happened in the world, we can listen to the cells, and if the cell spikes, fires in this burst of activity, we know that something interesting is happening that activates this cell. So here's where I lied before, and I'm going to show you now a picture of the brain again, so if you don't like it, that's the time to close your eyes. In fact, there is one way to study the brains of humans with electrodes inside. Not just rats, mice, and monkeys, but also humans. If we go back to the patients from the 60s, the patients that have seizures, I'm going to walk away from this picture, so whoever doesn't want to see would not be able to look at that. Right now, in our days, one of the ways to treat the epilepsy is actually not just by giving you medications, but by actually finding the source of the seizure in your brain, finding a part of the brain that actually activates the seizure, and taking it out. So what happens is the patients come to the room on day one, the surgeons open their brain and put electrodes deep inside their brain around the area where the seizure onset seems to be. Then they connect those wires to the computer, and they start recording what happens in the brain 24/7. So the patient sits there for days and days with his or her brain connected to the machine and just recording whatever happens in their brain. And presumably, in the course of the coming days, at some point, they're going to have a seizure. And now that we have a seizure with the patient and we have electrodes in their brain, we can actually trace the seizure flow in the brain. We can see how it moves in the brain, and we can see exactly what part of the brain starts it. And after the patient has 3 or 4 seizures and we really know exactly what part of the brain is the faulty part, we can take the wires out, we can resect only the damaged part, close everything, and the patient walks away seizure-free. So we actually fix the epilepsy. This is a rare procedure that helps patients, and it's also interesting because it allows us to do research on not humans. So basically what we say is there's a person there in bed with open brain, wires inside, connected to the computer, recording everything that's happening in his brain, waiting to have seizures for day and day. Maybe we can come to the guy and say, you know, you're already sitting and waiting to have a seizure. Do you mind also looking at movies, talking to me about your feelings and emotions, looking at playing all kinds of games, and allowing us to look at your brain from the inside? So not only animals, but maybe the most interesting animal I can think of, a human. Looking inside her brain. Now, this is how it looks. There's a person sitting in bed. We sit next to them. This is an example of a study we did with a person about smells. So the guy sits there. You see the wires coming out of his brain, and we have all kinds of smells attached to his nose. We try to see what activates the brain, and we can actually see how your brain works when smells are being injected into your nose, but also see the brain activity that happens when you smell those things. Okay, so this is a really rare and unusual way to study the brain directly by putting electrodes inside, looking at the brain the way the brain speaks in its own code. Okay, so let me show you for a second what we can get from that. Our electrodes land right at the center of the brain, so we actually listen to activities of individual cells at the heart of the brain, right at the center, where the emotions are, where your feelings, where your choices, where decisions, we actually access to you. We actually listen to where the most interesting part of your brain is by getting all the way in. If you just look at this kind of famous diagram of information in the brain, a famous picture shows that basically photons first hit your eye, your retina, and that's kind of where the world comes into your eye, and then they flow in all kinds of modules in the brain, all kinds of sites, process color, shape, smells, touch, all kinds of things kind of get access in your brain, and altogether in the end, when they all get aggregated to a part that's called the hippocampal formation, it becomes a percept. So maybe when you see something, you say, okay, there's a circle, and it's pink, and it's about 6 foot tall, and it has this voice that I recognize, and it smells like something I recognize. And when everything kind of comes together in the center of the brain, that's when you say, aha, it's my mom. And inside of your brain are the cells that actually collect all the information and say, okay, this is my mother. And to say to my mother is to actually activate a cell in this part of the brain. And I know it because we can actually listen to those cells and see how they work. And I'm going to show you an example of that. So here's one patient in Los Angeles. This is a study collected by a colleague of mine, Hagar Gerwal-Segiv. She has a patient sitting in bed, and the patient just sits there and watches movies. What you're going to see now above are the movies that she's watching. What I'm going to play to you is the sound of one cell in her brain, one cell out of 10 billion in her brain. And this cell is going to fire when something that she cares about is going to appear on the screen. Try to see for yourself if you can figure out what this cell cares about.
Welcome to Hollywood. Everybody comes to Hollywood.
You heard the spikes?
What's your dream? I have a dream that one day.
Welcome to Wall Street and the New York Stock Exchange, the world's largest and surprisingly one of...
Hey, Dad,
The Simpson. So this is the cell in this woman's brain that codes the Simpson. And it actually exists in all of your brains. If you knew what the Simpsons are, it means that in your brain right now when you watch this thing, there was a similar activity. Some cells in your brain became active, many of them became active and burst in activity, saying to other parts of the brain, aha, the Simpson is there. And in fact, those cells are more interesting than you think because they actually code not just the visual, but the percept, the concept. If you just smell something that reminds you of the Simpson, the cell is going to fire. If you tell a story and you're going to think of the Simpson, the cell is going to fire. In fact, we know that because Hagar came back to the patient after 2 hours and told them, you know what, let's do something else now. Now, no more inputs. You just sit there, close your eyes, and try to recall things that you've seen before. Just tell me which movies you've seen before. What I'm going to play to you right now is the same cell 2 hours later, where the woman just recounts in her mind things she's seen. But you're going to see that the cell for the Simpsons fires when she remembers the Simpson. In fact, it fires a second and a half before. So we can actually see her memory in action before she speaks.
Hollywood sign.
This is a cool moment. It's a moment where we have access to her memory before she expresses it. We have a second and a half gap between the moment I and you know about her thoughts and the moment she can actually experience them. So this is interesting because when I speak to you right now, I feel that everything I say kind of comes out in real time. I think that whatever I say is coming out of my mouth, and I listen to myself as much as you do. I'm not really planning my next word and choosing. This is the slowest I've ever spoken. We don't really plan the next word and kind of like choose the noun, the verb, put them together, organize them, replace them, and put them out. Like we experience language as if it comes out naturally. I'm observing my own language as much as you do. I'm kind of seeing what comes out as much as you do, and I can't really know what's going to come out next. But somehow, between us, there's a difference because I claim agency. I say it's my words, it's my thoughts. I assume responsibility of the one person who spoke out of my mouth. Now, what we can do with that is we can do all kinds of crazy stuff. We can actually see your thoughts in action, and we can now use them in many ways against you and in favor of you. So the way it's done normally is the patient comes to the hospital on day 1, we open the brain, we put the electrodes inside, the surgery is over. On day 2, I show up, and I spend about an hour talking to the patient about their feelings and behavior. I ask the patient what movies you like to watch, what party you vote for, what are you afraid of, what music you listen to, who do you like in sports, and basically asking about his experiences. And then I construct a set of about 100 pictures that reflect the things that are in his brain. So he says that he likes maybe a specific movie, I put a picture from that movie. He says that he likes to listen to the Beatles, I put a tune from the Beatles. He says he's voting for the Democrats, I put a picture of Bill Clinton, and so on. And what we do first is we show the patients a bunch of pictures, one after the other, of all the things that we think are in his or her brain. So for about half an hour, we just show pictures, and you see a picture of Halle Berry, an actress, a picture of the Eiffel Tower, a picture of a spider, another picture of Halle Berry, and so on. What we do then is we look at the brain out of many cells we listen to, and we try to see if there's any cell that kind of becomes active and codes for the concept that the person was seeing. So maybe there's going to be one cell in, say, part of the brain called the amygdala that shows this activity. So it has one burst of activity when the patient was seeing the picture of Halle Berry, and another activity when the patient sees a picture of the spider, but something that doesn't seem to kind of correspond to anything specific. Maybe it's a different cell, a different area that goes in this way. Maybe there's a third cell in the hippocampus that seems to fire in this pattern. So every time you see the picture of Halle Berry, the cell fires. We say, aha, this cell seems to care about Halle Berry. Let's see if it's really true. Let's take only this particular cell and all of the times that we showed Halle Berry to this person versus all the times we show other pictures, and we see if this cell always fires when you see Halle Berry compared to other things. And we see that indeed the cell fires for Halle Berry. And then we say, let's do something else. Let's take other pictures of Halle Berry, not just the same picture, but other pictures of her. What we do here is we take a bunch of pictures. You see here a lineup of all the pictures that we showed to the patient, and on the top line, you see all the pictures of Halle Berry. And the same cell fires every time a picture of Halle Berry is shown, including different versions of it. So we call it an invariant cell. It doesn't fire for a specific picture. It fires for pictures of Halle Berry with short and long hair, wearing glasses, without glasses. It fires for cartoon images of Halle Berry. It fires for the text Halle Berry or for the sound Halle Berry, or even for 3 pictures of a woman dressed in a cat suit that the patient knows is Halle Berry in a movie. You can't really see her, but the patient knows her, and the same cell fires. So this cell fires in an invariant fashion to every version of the thought that's in your mind. So now I can do the most impressive thing, which is read your mind. I can, in the morning, show you a bunch of pictures and find cells that code for different concepts, like the Eiffel Tower, like Spider-Man, like Halle Berry. And once I find those cells in the morning, I can basically have you think about things the way you want, and I can just project onto a screen in front of your eyes your thoughts. Still images of your thoughts, one after the other. This is interesting, because we can now see thoughts that you yourself don't see. Here's a nice example of that. So I'm showing you this picture that's flickering in front of your eyes. You all see it. And I'm telling you right now that your brain already sees a mismatch. Your brain is already kind of not sure about what's going on here, because what actually happens here is that there's 2 pictures. There's 2 different pictures that alternate. They're very similar, but there's one difference between them. And your brain sees it right away. Before I even said that your brain immediately sees the difference, I want you to raise your hand when you see the difference. Don't say just raise. I want to see if everyone sees it already. There's a difference that's kind of noticeable. Those of you who don't see it are kind of concerned right now. They're trying to say, okay, maybe it's the Canada flag on the left, maybe it's the cap on the soldier's head, maybe it's the shadow, maybe it's the blue. You're kind of concerned. Your friends are already seeing that. You're feeling pretty stupid now. If you don't see it right now, come to me afterwards. We have a procedure that can help you. Right in the center, the engine of the airplane disappears and appears. Your brain saw it right away. In your brain, there's a cell that kind of identifies engines, and as soon as you saw the first picture, it fired. As soon as it saw the second one, it didn't fire. So it fires, doesn't fire, doesn't fire. But you yourself are asking yourselves, tell me where this difference is. And your brain knows it, but it doesn't share it with this person who speaks last. Here's another example of that. Just so if you felt smart in the previous one, you can feel dumb right now. Raise your hand when you see it. Okay. This one is harder, I guess. Is it the windows on the house? Is it the chimney, the shadows? It's the branch of leaves on the left. You all see it right now? Good. Interesting moment. Your brain sees it. There's cells in your brain that code for branches. They become active and silent, but you yourself, even though you ask your brain, are not exposed to it. Which means that we can not only look at your brain, we can actually look at all kinds of sides in your brain and see who knows what at what point and see how they interact. When we published our work in 2010 showing movies of the brain, it was followed up by a bunch of people who did something that was similar with fMRI, a different tool to look at the brain, where they first had people look at movies and scan their brain and found the part of the brain that codes for specific images like people or places. And then once they mapped the brain using this machine, they actually had people come over again. This time they had them watch new movies that they didn't see before, and now the brain just has a machine learning algorithm sitting on top of it and reads who speaks when and try to see, okay, I guess the part that spoke earlier when you saw people are active now, so you must see a person, or maybe it's a fish, and you can actually decode people's thoughts without opening their brain and putting electrodes inside. This is a pretty fancy version of our work that goes one step further, but here's the one moment I want to spend 2 minutes being inspiring for a second. When we published our work in 2010, it was the hallmark of how you can actually study the brain by using the activities of cells. I was very proud of that, and we spent a lot of time making sure that it's really getting reach to a lot of people. So we spoke to all the news outlets, we spoke to everyone who can listen to it, because it was interesting to show how you can really read the activity of people when they're looking at images. This did not go well. I, at some point in one of the evenings, spoke to BBC Nightly News, and they asked me about the future. What could be done in the future with your ability to actually record people, to look at people's thoughts and visualize them on the screen? And I said, in the future, you can also look at people's emotions and dreams. And the person said, wait, what do you mean? You can look at people's dreams? I said, well, it's possible. And the day after, the headline on BBC was, the recording device is possible, researcher claims. Just to be clear, we did not do that. It wasn't possible at the time, and it was totally science fiction. But this was a good headline, so a few hours later, it was picked up by everything in the media, and all of the next 10 days were dominated by all kinds of news media speaking about how dream encoding is doable, how we already do that, how we actually have a database of all the dreams, how the CIA behind my study and kind of collects the dreams, and on and on. And it became something that was so big that it trumped everything that happened that week scientifically, and the story only died after 10 days when Prince William proposed to his wife. Now wife. So I was pretty upset at the time, feeling that this is like a failure of my communication to explain our study, and all people remember is how we can encode dream, which is not even true. And this is where the inspiring part comes, because 4 years later, 2014, a year ago, I get a call from BBC again, and they say, we want you to go again on the news and speak about recording dreams. And I say, are you kidding me? It's already been 4 years, it's already over, we said it's not true, leave me alone. I said, no, not about your work. Comment on the work of a group in Kyoto by Yuki Kamitani, who actually took what you said in the paper and just did that. And they did exactly what we said. They took people, had them go to sleep, let them dream and wake them up time and again every time they sleep, while they look at their activity and look at their dreams and basically parse their dreams. And the inspiring part is what I thought was science fiction in 2010 and spent a lot of time arguing against, seeing it's never going to happen, took 4 years later for them to do that, took 1 more year for us to do that. So when I talk to my students, I always tell them, read science fiction books, look at the part where they say a spaceship that flies to the moon or a submarine that goes underground, write down and put it in an experiment. It might come up in 4 years later. Okay, so after we did that, we said, okay, if we find cells in your brain that code your thinking of Marilyn Monroe, Michael Jackson, your mom, love, or anything, we can do anything we want with that. We don't have to just show you pictures of the things that you think about. We can also maybe activate machines based on those things. So here's one example we did. We found a person who had a cell in his brain that fires for Ronald Reagan. And we told this guy, whenever you think about Ronald Reagan, this little triangle on the left is going to climb up. So we asked you to basically play a game where you're trying to avoid hitting those buildings coming from the right just by thinking of Ronald Reagan. This is sped up much faster, it's a lot slower, but the person you can see does pretty well in activating a machine, playing a game on the screen. This is a pretty nasty game because we built it in 5 minutes, but you can imagine a much more fun game with more buttons than just one going up and down. But we actually created a game the person can play now for hours, just controlling things with their minds. Now you can think of people actually changing channels on TV or moving their wheelchair if they can't move their hands and doing all kinds of things the same way. We find ourselves in the brain in the morning that codes for a thought, and then we connect to a machine and have you activate things in the world the way you want. Here's another nasty picture. It's a picture of something nasty just to illustrate that we don't just find cells that code for people and percepts, we also find cells that code for emotions. So here's one example. We show this person a bunch of pictures from all kinds of walks of life, like happy pictures of Disney characters and smiling people, and awful pictures of bad things that you can think about life and not like. And what we see is that we can actually see what cells code for bad things and good things. And we can even see how you control your feelings. So we can actually look at your brain and put electrodes in different part of your brain and see that first I put a picture in front of your eyes. I count this at time 0. And see how long it takes your eyes to process information. At what point you get to the part of the brain that actually fires for nasty things. So I can see how long it takes you to feel bad when you see a bad picture, about a quarter of a second. I can see, if I tell you to not feel bad, how another part of the brain becomes active afterwards, telling the first part to shut down. And we can see how you suppress your emotions. So we can actually train people now on stopping trauma and actually getting better. You take a person that maybe came back from Afghanistan and saw horrible things and cannot stop thinking about things, and we can now put electrodes in the brain and give him or her feedback on how well they do in forgetting things and help them basically suppress their thoughts, make them control their emotions such that they relive the memories so they remember things without reliving them. So we can actually now look at your brain and help you by giving you feedback, control your own experiences. We can help you in many ways. We can help you suppress thoughts or enhance thoughts. In a project we have now in the White House, we actually look at people's response to climate change. So climate change is a very interesting thing because it's something bad that happens far away in the future, and you can't really perceive that. It's not going to happen to you, and it's too far to think about. So we actually have people look at 2 movies. One movie is a movie of a spider crawling towards you. Another movie is Algo speaking about climate change. And we look at the part of the brain that kind of responds to fear. So as you can imagine, spiders makes part of the brain really, really light up because it's scary. Algo, not as much. Now we can give you feedback on fear, teach you about climate change, and help you learn how to enhance the fear by making you experience more fear and actually tell you this thing that you thought about right now worked, this thing didn't work, and we can actually create the best messages. We can help the government create the best messages such that it's going to work on the brain perfectly so you will feel the most. So you can actually study the brain and see what makes you experience most of messages. Also, we can speak to your brain behind your back. So in a study that was done in the 80s in San Francisco, Benjamin Libet basically took people and had them play a simple game where they have a clock in front of their eyes, the clock rotates really fast, and they're asked to press a button whenever they want to stop a clock. Pretty easy. So they sit there, the clock revolves, they press a button, the clock stops, and then he asks them one more thing. He says, tell me when you felt the urge, the will to stop the clock. So he marks the moment P as the moment the button was pressed, and the moment W is the moment the person reports feeling the desire to press to stop the clock. So it's a bit tricky, like when do you feel that you wanted something before you do it? We did the same thing with our patients. Because we are inside their brain, we can actually see how their thoughts become active, how they still become active before they press the button, but also before they feel the urge. Here's how it looks. So about a second and a half before you press the button, and about 2 seconds before you perceive that, I can know that you're going to press a button. Now, if I know that, if I know something about you before you know it, I can actually do all kinds of fancy stuff, like play a game against you. I can actually have you, say, drive a car, and see how far before you make a turn I know that you're going to make a turn. So here's a game we play with the patient. We have them drive a car. We tell them, when you reach an intersection, choose to go left or right. And we try to see how far before they get to the intersection can we know what they're going to choose already. They don't even see that there's an option right now. Now they see the options. Now they get there. They make a choice. And now they report to us when they felt they made a choice to make a right turn in this case. And we can see the difference between when I know about your choice and when you know about your choice. And you see that there's a few seconds apart. And the coolest thing we can do is we can play your brain against you in the following way. So recently we play a game with our patients that's the most extreme. We do the following. We tell the guy, we're going to play a simple game about decision making. So you come to the lab and there's a box in front of your eyes, and the box has 2 buttons, left and right. We ask you to make a choice, simple choice, left or right. That's all. So you sit there and we say, whenever you want to, press left button or right button, and then another trial begins, press left, right, and so on. It's a pretty simple choice. Shouldn't be that difficult for you. Just one thing, when you press the buttons, we need to save data from your brain. So when you press buttons, there's going to be a light coming up for 1 second. This tells you that we're saving data from the brain, so make sure you don't touch the button when the light's already on. So the light's on, just wait for a second, it's going to turn off, and you can start another trial. Okay, that's all. So press left, lights on, lights off, press right, lights on, lights off. For like 1 hour, you do just that. Pretty simple. In fact, this is not the full story. This study is not about decision making at all. It's about free will. We find cells in your brain after a few trials that tell us at time 0 that in 5 seconds, you're going to press the buttons. So we can either wait 5 seconds and have you press the button, or we can wait 4.9 seconds and turn the lights on by themselves. So basically what happens is that you're about to reach to the buttons, and just when you're about to press the button, the light turns on by itself, and you press the button, and the light's already on. And now there's a buzzer in the room, and we tell you, what did you do? We told you not to do one thing. We told you not to press the button, and the light's already on. I'm sorry, doctor, it happened by itself. It kind of happened just before. Never mind, just don't do it again. I promise. Reach out. As soon as you press, the light's turning on by itself. Tell you, what happened? We just told you not to do it. I'm so sorry. It kind of happens. After a few trials, the patient realizes that every time she or he want to do something, we're ahead of them. They try to do it faster. They can't do it faster. We're in their brain, right? As fast as they know, we know. They try to kind of go to the right and change to the left. They can't do that because we're inside their brain. No matter what they do, they try to kind of go and not press, and then everything they do actually works against them because we're inside their brain and we know ahead of them. And that's an interesting moment. Here's how it goes. First, the person just sits there and presses the button regularly. We have a machine learning algorithm that sits on his brain and basically finds those cells that tell us before the button is pressed. And when we reach a threshold that's good for us, then we say, OK, we're ready to now move to step 2. We, unbeknownst to the patient, move to step 2, where we try to activate the machine just based on our knowledge of his brain. So this is still the learning. And now it moves automatically to the testing phase. And this is an interesting moment. It's a moment where I basically pit my knowledge of your brain against you. I'm sitting ahead of you in your brain, and I'm using that information to stop you from doing things in your own brain. Imagine all the characters I mentioned before, the people who sit in your brain. Now I actually access them before you do. I'm fast enough to actually change things in your brain before you get there. And that's an interesting moment, because it's a moment you get a visceral experience of no free will. How I actually can use, you still have free will, it just happens much earlier, and I know about it before you do. This means that I can actually now access those people and pit them against you in all kinds of ways. Now, we experience this kind of competition between the people in the brain all the time. One example of that is self-control. So a lot of times we decide that we're going to diet this week, or we're going to exercise all the time, or we're going to not eat the food, or we're going to do all kinds of things. And we make decisions totally by ourselves. We go to sleep setting the alarm to 6 a.m., but somehow in the morning when we wake up, we're not the same people anymore. Somehow in the morning, it's a different person who kind of wakes up and doesn't want to wake up anymore. And it's the same brain, but two different characters who were there, and one set the alarm to 6 a.m., and the other one woke up. The question is, can we give you access to the other person in the brain and let them work together? So what we do right now is we partner with Red Bull, the drinks company, and on top of drinks, they also sponsor a lot of athletes, elite athletes. So we bring those athletes to the lab, and we have them basically exercise in the following way. Tell them, go on the treadmill, sorry, this one is a stationary bike, go on the bike and start cycling. We're going to make it harder and harder on you, and we're going to monitor everything we can do about you. We can monitor your heart rate, your oxygen, your head, of course, your muscles. We can also draw blood every minute from for everything you can do. And we're going to also make it harder and harder on you. And we ask you one thing, don't ever stop. Please start. The person says, I'm sorry, just continue and don't ever stop. The person says, what do you mean not stop? Just continue. And the guy cycles for a few minutes, and it gets harder and harder. And at some point, there's kind of a battle in his brain, because there's part of the brain that says, OK, I shouldn't stop, I'm going to continue. And another part of the brain says, it's painful, I should stop. And at first, it's very easy. This one wins all the time. But after a few minutes, this becomes like that, and like that. And at some point, the battle is really, really hard until you collapse, until you just say, OK, enough, I can't do it anymore. And what we can do then is we can look at the brain and see how your brain looks at the moment of collapse, the moment where you basically are losing control. And now that we find that we can actually see two things. We can give you feedback about that moment. So we can tell you tomorrow, come back again to the gym, do the same thing, but today we're going to give you feedback. We're going to tell you when you're at the moment that you failed yesterday. It doesn't have to be distance. It's a moment where your brain is about to stop. And we're going to tell you, when you get to this moment, just stay there a little longer. Just continue at that moment. So can you train your brain rather than yourself? Athletes say that their brain is a muscle that they don't get trained a lot. So, there's all kinds of stories about athletes who, at the moment, could run a little faster than ever in their training, or people that in the last second could kind of silence the entire audience and shoot into the basket without noticing everyone else. People tend to win more games, home games, than outside. Something happens in the brain. Right now, we don't train athletes by their brain, we train them by their muscles. But now we can actually train you looking at your brain. We can do the other thing. We can actually take people that are not athletes and see who has the brain of an athlete and say, you know what, kid, you're a 5-year-old kid, but your brain is the brain of a person who can continue when things are hard. You should be a football player, because you already have the brain of one. So you just have to train your muscles. We can actually see how it works. And this is interesting because we all live in a world where it's really hard to do what we want. This is an example I really like. In Los Angeles' 24-hour fitness gym, people come to the gym to exercise. They come to train. There's two options. There's the escalators or there's the stairs. Now, they came to exercise. But even though they can exercise, when you give them an option to do something easy, they all choose the easy way up, even though they came to train. In a way, the world we created is hard on us. We created the snooze button in the clock, right? Why do we need that one? Because we know that our brain is not great. So instead of fixing our brain, we fix the world. We create all kinds of things to make things easier for us. Most people die right now from things that are actually man-made. And I'm not talking about smoking, diabetes, accidents. Those are all things that people didn't die from 100 years ago. But now we created a world that caters to the problems in our character and actually makes it harder for us to live life normally. And it might be even worse if we think about climate change and things that are in the future. So now we can actually look at that and see how to make a world that caters best to your brain rather than to your flaws in your brain. Ultimately, there's also a business side to that. Because if we understand how the brain works, we can actually see how the brain experiences things and what part of the brain enjoys things. So what we do right now is to also look at the brain of people who watch messages, who listen to political speeches, who watch TV or listen to radio, and try to see if we can tell by their brain how interesting and engaging the content is. If you can somehow look at your brain and see the person who experiences things, rather than the person who actually goes and does things afterwards, and see how messages work on your brain. So we study engagement right now and try to see how your brain compares to other people's brains, and see if we can somehow put content in front of your eyes and see how content affects your brain. So we can actually take examples like 2 movies. One is very boring, one is interesting. So here's an example of 2 examples. Here's a very interesting movie, 30-second scene from The Matrix. very engaging, even though there's no words. All of our brains are kind of consumed by this thing. The directors of this thing knew how to talk into your brain and make your brains all look alike. And now we can actually measure how the brain look alike in the same way. Because to be a good artist, in many ways, is to somehow be able to sit at home and tap into many people's brains and know how they're going to work, such that you create content that caters and kind of recruits a lot more of the brain. So we can now see how content specifically is looking at a lot of brains and see what happens to a lot of brains versus content that's very boring. This is an 8.5 movie by Andy Warhol called Empire, where what you see is the Empire State Building in black and white. So assuming that you're looking at that right now, most of your brains give it a little bit of attention, but then you're all flowing in a different direction. Maybe one of you thinks about cottage cheese that you have to buy, one of you thinks about the assignments you have to do. Your brains kind of fall out. So now I can look at all of your brains and actually see how content affects multiple brains, not just one multiple character in one brain, but all of characters. And we can see things like taking a movie theater full of people and put machines all over the theater. So this is a project we did last year. We partnered with AMC Theaters in Chicago. We closed the movie theater. Every person who came to the theater was asked to either walk home or participate in a study. I told them the theater is closed, but if you want to watch a movie, you can watch it for free if you only let us put something on your head and measure how you respond to movies. And now what we have to do is we have basically everyone in the audience sit there with a machine on their head, watching a movie, and we can see how the content itself affects the brain. And we can now figure out what ending is best for the movie. What message that this president says in the State of the Union is actually going to resonate with people? What TV show is going to be more interesting? If I'm trying to convince you to be afraid of something, how it's going to work? So we can actually look at content, look at the brain. And I'm experimenting today with actually making sure that you're going to remember that. I tried to do something new. I said, okay, I want to make sure that you remember something from this thing. Since this is the newest work, I have a new way of making the study memorable, which is showing you the slides in a different format. Okay. Oh, it's not gonna work with my microphone. Okay, we're gonna have to somehow find a way. So what you see here is two brains being scanned simultaneously. Everything's gonna fall apart. Here is that we can actually take multiple brains, scan them simultaneously, and see that there's moments where all the brains look alike. And if the brains look alike, it means that the content is so engaging that somehow the director is so good that it actually recruits all of the brains in the same way. It's true for artists, it's true for musicians, it's true for speakers. Somehow, if I'm really engaging right now, then what happens is that all of your brains not only are considering my content, but your eyes are all in the same place, and I can actually show you a graph of how content changes over time, and know exactly at what moment in my talk all of you are interested, in what moment in my talk you're all bored. So I can actually now create content that's tailored to multiple brains. I can see how the brains of women different than men, how people that are old different than people that are young, and we can actually start looking at the content rather than the observer and seeing all the people in your brain, see how they interact, and create a content that perfectly matches those audiences. Okay. I'm gonna try to skip that in a sequence of time, just and show you where it's actually used. Sorry. So we can actually have the multiple people sitting in the audience, and we show you all kinds of things, and we can then go back to you and say, okay, we showed you a bunch of clips before. Let's see what you're going to remember afterwards. Let's see who you are at each moment, and actually learn something about your experience of the content. So here's an example. Here's a commercial that AMC shows in every movie in the beginning. So all of you, if you've been to an AMC theater, you've probably seen this thing.
Coming soon to AMC.
And what we can do afterwards is try to see how the brain differs when you watch this content. So here's, for example, a commercial of Coca-Cola at AMC theaters. What you see here in the yellow line is the average of all brains when they watch this thing. So how similar are all brains when you watch this content? So if I average everyone in the audience right now, you look at this yellow line. meaning all of your brain are somewhat interested in that, but not too much. And there's moments that are a little bit more interesting, and moments that are a little less, but not too much. And it's all happening to you. You don't really choose to be interested in something or not. It kind of happens by itself. But now I can take the same content and break you apart into groups. Maybe look at all the men in the audience. Let's do that. And now look at the brain just of the guys in the audience. Now you're going to see that the average that I'm showing you there actually comes from a different breakdown. So we can actually now look at content and the audience and learn something about your experience of content in your brain and figure out what content works best. If I want a message to go for men, I can make one content. If I want a message to go to women, I can do a different way. If I look at kids or adults, if I want to talk to people who are busy or tired, I can actually craft the content perfectly to whoever you are and figure out exactly what content works best. So I can control the content, I can control the memorability of the content, I can control what happens inside and outside your brain. And ultimately, I can actually get access to all the little entities inside your brain. And this is where I'm going to end, by telling you the following thing. We live in a world right now where we finally get access to parts of the brain that are buried under the hood. So when you see the world, you're already way behind after reality. You see everything in color. You see everything already processed by smell and by touch. You can't really decide to shut down the color part of your brain and just see black and white. Even though it's in your brain, it's somewhere in the back, you cannot just say, OK, I'm going to see black and white right now for a second. I want to see what things are. I cannot really activate things that are not accessible to you. It's all happening under this little kind of radar, and you get exposed to things at the end. What we're doing right now is we put electrodes inside your brain, and we give you access to parts that are behind the curtains, parts that you don't really see normally. And in a way, it changes everything. Because now the options in our brain are much bigger. I like the analogy of the world in 1610, when Galileo Galilei pointed his telescope to the moons of Jupiter and tried to look at the orbits of Jupiter, and he saw that something didn't add up. He thought that things are going to go in one way, but they went in a different way. And this made him kind of change all his equations. And the only solution that worked out was one in which the sun is the center of the universe rather than the Earth. And he was very concerned by that because it meant dethronement of men. It meant that we're not the center of our own universe, and maybe it means that we're not in control of everything. But once he accepted it, and once everyone went with him, we learned that the universe is much bigger than we imagined, and it allowed us to actually go far outside of the universe and see a lot out there, more than we could actually ever imagine exists. In the same way, we are now experiencing a dethronement of our own self. We used to think of ourselves as one person inside our brain who decides everything. And what we see right now is that there's more than one person in our brain. There's many of them who control us. And in a way, we're no longer the main character in our own story. This can be seen as a dethronement of men on the inside, because suddenly there's more than one person who controls who I am, and maybe I'm not even the most important one. But I think that in the same way that we got exposed to a vast amount of information when we got out to the universe, we're now getting exposed to the most interesting thing in the universe, which is our own brain and ourselves. Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay. Is sitting here?
Sit here, yeah.
Okay.
So that was fascinating. Thank you. So first of all, why do you think our brains have evolved? So first of all, it's maybe asking a different way. I assume that you believe that our evolution fundamentally works and our brains are designed this way for some utility.
So I think it's not good to let a person who's not a car mechanic touch your car. In the same way, biology said it's not good to let humans access their brain. We just should hide a lot of them and just let them handle only the outcome, but the inside. The example that I like to give is about the tennis game. So if you play tennis against someone and they're doing really well and they're beating you, the best course of action would be the following. Tell them, oh my God, you have an amazing serve. How do you do that? Tell me how to do that. And then you actually ask them to think about their serve and be aware of their action. And as soon as they do that, they're going to lose it. Because our brain is doing something perfectly by itself. And as soon as we become aware of that, everything falls apart. Like breathing, like stepping on stairs, all of those things work perfectly if we don't touch them. As soon as we get exposed to them, everything falls apart. Our brain is not meant for us to play with in the sense that as the more we know, we basically change things. And biology did it just for that. They kind of put a lot of things under the hood, so we won't toy with them.
So in a way, I mean, what you're talking about in a lot of your examples is that we're fundamentally self-deceived. that we think something is going on, but in fact that's pretty far from the truth as well as far from what we know. And I think some of your examples are showing that your brain may be, I think your examples were more intent, but there's sort of the other thing, which is, I think we talked about it a little bit, but galvanic skin response showing that you understand things that you consciously don't, right?
So I can repeat the example, and I can also tell you something I didn't mention today about this deception that's actually interesting. So on skin conductance, we know that your body listens to cues outside, and it reads them well, and it responds to them much faster than your conscious side. So here's an example of that. There's a classical study that people love to talk about called the Iowa gambling task. It's a simple experiment where people come to the lab, and they're exposed to 4 decks of cards. And they're told, here's the game. You have to pick a card, and the cards are upside down, so you don't see what's coming out. You have to pick a card, and if the card that you land on is a jack, king, or queen, you get $1, and if you pick anything else, you lose half $1. So all you have to do is just pick cards from each deck. You just pick a deck, and hopefully make a lot of money. Turns out that of those 4 decks in front of you, there's 2 really good ones and 2 pretty bad. So 2 of them have a lot more of the good cards, and 2 have a lot of the bad cards. People start and they pick a card from deck number 1, it's a jack, win $1, deck number 2, 3, 4, and so on. They do it for about a few trials, about 100 trials, and after 100 trials, they realize by themselves that actually there's 2 good ones. So they kind of say, okay, I figure that those are the better one, and they're just picking only cards from those 2, and they ignore the other 2 cards. It takes them, if you ask them, about 100 trials, 100 cards from 25 from each deck, before they say, I now learned that these are the good ones, these are the bad ones. But if you put something that measures their skin conductance on their fingers, you see that about 20 trials into the game, when they're reaching to card number 3 and 4, deck number 3 and 4, they already show a heightened sense of risk when they go to those decks. So their body already knows far earlier than they know that something bad happens when you go this way, but it takes them 60 more cards or 80 more cards to know themselves. So our biology is like behind on things. It's made in such a way so we're going to take risks, but our body sometimes knows risks a lot earlier than we do know. On deception, I think the interesting thing is that we can deceive the conscious you, but the not conscious you actually isn't always deceived. And here's a nice version of that. So I mentioned to you the study where we know at time 0 that the person, so we know here that the person is going to wait 5 seconds and going to press the button, and we basically wait 4.9 seconds, and we turn them on by themselves. So this is like an easy way. As soon as we know that you're about to do something, we just wait a little less, and we turn the button on themselves. This is nice, but it's actually not the coolest thing we did. The coolest thing comes now. So I know here that you're going to press the button a little bit before, I wait a little bit before you press the button, and I turn on, and I kind of toy your brain against you. But what I can also do is something even more interesting. I know here that you're going to do it in 5 seconds. I can turn the lights on already here. So what happens is that the lights turn on as soon as I know because your brain told me, and it's happening so early that it actually happens without you knowing that it's coming from your brain. So what you experience is the lights turning on, lights turning off, on, off. All of that happens because of your brain telling me that you want that, but the lights turning on are so early before your consciousness that it actually stops you from being aware of it. So what you experience is something happening, and you don't even know that you wanted it. So it kind of stops you. And so what you say is like, oh, there's something weird, the lights are on and off, but because your brain knows that it wanted it, the cell in your brain that kind of sent the signal starts seeing that it sends a signal to the world, and the feedback that it gets is that it didn't get activated. So it gets confused, and after a while, it stops firing. So I can actually see that your brain stops working for a little bit because I played it against you, but all that happens behind your back. So me and your brain speak about you behind your back. You're not there. You're just like saying, I don't know what's going on, but your brain tells me, oh, something didn't work out. So this is a full deception that's accessible to me and not to you. It's a version of what we do all the time, which is lie to ourselves. We all buy clothes to the thinner us. We all buy membership to gyms based on like who we think we're going to go, and we don't do it. But if I look at your brain, I can actually see who is the person who signs the contract, who is the person who does things, and learn how deception works, and actually give you access to deceptive you. And tell you, Joey, you just did something that your brain tells me you don't want to do. Let's talk about that. Let's see if you actually want to do that or not. And the feedback is just a way to give you access to who you really are in a different part of your brain.
But there's training that allows people to access. So, for instance, I think there was a study on whether you can tell whether someone is lying. And I think there's a basic evolutionary trait, which is that you tend not to call people out on deception because it makes you feel bad, and the cost of false positive is fairly high. But lawyers and policemen train themselves to pick the liars, right? But then they tend to be unhappy, and there's all these side effects. And then there's people, for instance, Tibetan monks who meditate and start to be able to access parts of their brain that you couldn't access before. What do you think that these techniques obviously could be used to train people to become more aware?
So I love lying
Yeah.
as a concept because lying is a mechanism that with some animals and humans invented. It's a strange, smart thing to do. It's a way to protect others. It's a way to protect ourselves. It's a way to create. So, but we know when we lie. We might be so good at that we actually bury it quickly after, but we know. And it turns out that because we know, we expose it to other people. So lawyers, monks, some people are becoming more tuned to that and they can actually know better. And the question now is a social question. So I'm lying to you and to myself, maybe. You know it, and you're now lying back to me by not telling me that I'm lying, by not exposing it. So we kind of play a game where lies become just part of a conversation. And it's a way to live life perfectly normally. So I lie, but I don't want to hurt you. You know, like, you ask me, did I gain weight? You're asking to be lied to. You know the answer. I know the answer. We both kind of are playing the game. So it's a social game that's has a kind of a label of being bad, but I think it's great. I think it's just another version of us conversing. And the people who are good at that suffer a little bit the price of living life in a way that isn't supposed to be lived. Like lies are part of the way that nature signals things to each other.
And I think we've had various conversations at the Media Lab. I think one of the problems of the science of deception is a lot of scientists believe in truth, right? And that they don't like lies. And deception has a very morally loaded. It's a morally loaded word, right? But having said that, if what you say is true, and I think it is, that most of what we think is actually a self-deception, and most of what we say, whether we know it or not, has deception built into it, and so it's interesting. How do you think that? And you talked about the science fiction and the effect that it had on science. I mean, what do you think the role of deception or signals that aren't completely truthful is in things like science?
So I think that I'm separating the lies that we tell ourselves from the lies we tell others. So those are kind of two different lies, and I think that the more interesting ones are the ones that tell ourselves.
Yeah.
I tell my students when I teach business school students, and I talk to them about one example that I really love, which is pornography and organic food. Those are pretty different domains, but actually there's one similarity between them in the business world, which is organic food companies, they want to open say a supermarket in your zip code, and it's going to be more expensive. So they come to your zip code first and they run a survey in your zip code and they say, how likely are you to buy food if you open a supermarket here? It's going to be more expensive, but it's going to be much healthier for you. And people say in the survey, of course we're going to buy it. We love organic food and we're going to pay more before health. And then they open, in some place in Los Angeles, they open a very more expensive organic food restaurant or supermarket in a zip code, and it always fails because people come to buy like the true self who doesn't really answer surveys. In the same way, pornography, there are studies on pornography, and people get asked how much you watch porn, and people never watch porn. In fact, one person out of 100 actually admits to watching porn. And if you look at the bandwidth on the internet, it's most of the bandwidth. So there's one guy who just runs around and watches all the porn, or people just lie. And we lie because we are biased by who looks at us. We're biased by who we want to be. We think, and all of those lies are the lies that are interesting to me, because those are lies that actually it's an interesting moment in your brain. There is a person who knows the answer, and it speaks, and it says, yes, watch porn every day. There's another part of the brain that says, but someone watches us, let's silent. And now they're exposed to it. They're both speaking out there, and they agree together to say, let's say this, because we want to seem like someone else, because we don't want to tell people about ourselves, because we want to protect. So they now work together to protect this entity called the I together. So they say, okay, we think that it's the best answer is this. Or if everyone agrees, they all vote, they say yes. I speak in the voice of them. And it's all of the parts of my brain, including the one that knows the right answer, saying, let's protect Moran, Joey, and kind of make sure that everyone treats us like the one that you are. So we kind of give a side to only one.
Right, but when you put the moral lens or even the legal lens, it's very different if you know and intentionally lie versus unintentionally lie, right? I mean, at least morally. Maybe functionally it's quite similar. And I think if you're, for instance, a scientist and you believe something, and maybe you're primed to believe it through your self-deception, it's very different from somebody who intentionally falsifies it knowingly. But you.
So here's my view on science. So in science, there's lying. So there's lying that simply like you see that the answer was 5, you just scratch it and you put 4, and that's one type of lying. That's the one that I'm not a fan of. But there's the lying that is that happens a lot in science, which is you run a study and I did a study like that, and we try to see if we can find a characteristic of autism in the brain. So we bring people, and we look at them, and all the people who are autistics fall in this side of the bar, and everyone who does not falls in this side of the bar. And everything fits perfectly, and then comes a guy who, according to the measures, he's autistic, and we study his brain, and he falls on that side of the bar. And say, oh, it ruins everything. Everything was perfect until now. 10 subjects were all perfect. This guy solves everything. And then we start saying, well, let me think about this guy. Of course, he was the only guy who had glasses. So now let's put in our paper studying people without glasses. So I think that these are the lies that we actually tell ourselves. We immediately find reasons to tell ourselves a story why something didn't work out. And this is something that science does, unfortunately, a lot of the time because we want to protect the story. We're not just scratching the 5 and putting a 4, but we're saying, what could explain what I want the world to be? This is similar to the two. We kind of live in the present and we kind of go back in time. Instead of lying, I think that if you talk legally, the question is the question of Charles Whitman, the guy who killed those people from the top of the Austin, Texas building. He is at fault because he killed them. We know that his brain was not working, but we also know that he wrote in his diary the day before that he is feeling not okay, and he could have done so. The question becomes a question of like, at what point do you stop and you say, okay, this person is at fault? And the criminal world is really struggling with that because the more we know about the brain, we find more and more people that are lying to protect something that is inaccessible to them, but they actually are there.
So, I mean, I guess the one idea is if you can start to understand and recognize the patterns of self-deception and you're trying to get to truth. I don't know if it's published, so I can't go into detail, but Karthik Dinakar is working on a human-in-the-loop computation problem where you have a doctor and a patient and you record their conversation, and actually you can figure out what the real problem is, even though neither of them actually know. And I think what might be kind of interesting is to think about, you know, at some level you have this whole society of scientists who talk to each other and are saying things, but maybe as machine learning gets better and we can start to analyze patterns, we can figure out a system that actually knows what's going on.
I totally believe that. So I believe that external and internal. So we can look at the brain, we can analyze your behavior, and we can actually know something that you either are not disclosing or not, and mostly not aware of. So you actually don't know that that you want this thing and that you're lying to yourself, and we can help you. So one way is to look at deception as a way. You deceive yourself. We have access to your brain, and we're going to give you a feedback telling you, look, we know that something doesn't sit well with you right now. You answer this question. You spoke to your doctor. You chose a simple choice of food. We know that your brain tells us that this is not a clean choice for you. Do whatever you want with that. That's like step one. Instead of like flagging liar and don't do that, we can just give you indication that suggests that something is not sitting right. So we can have people answer surveys. And we see that sometimes they put an A on the survey and their A is fully coherent with their brain. Sometimes they put an A on a question and we see that they have conflict. So we don't know what they actually wanted to do, but we know that this A in the survey is not the same A as the other A. So we can now treat their survey differently. We can say, okay, here's 10 questions a person answer when they came to the doctor. We can know, okay, these are okay. These ones, doctor should ask in a different way. Or maybe we should look at, when we come to diagnose a person, we should actually look at the weights differently and we give higher weights to this one rather than this one because the person somehow isn't okay with that. And we can now use that as a way to help you, not just to...
So do you think like, for instance, obviously when you're sitting around and having dinner, you're less concerned about truth and more concerned about happiness and social dynamics. But when you're in a lab, work in front of your lab notebook, you probably want to be as close to the truth as you want. Can you imagine like a way to have a dial that dials up your biases and dials down your biases? Because sometimes, like that picture, sometimes you don't want to see something bad. But in some moments, you should be able to override it. And I think your body right now governs that for you, right? When you're in certain states and certain chemical balances, your body probably gives you more truth. And in some cases, it probably dampens it. But maybe there should be this thing where when you walk into your lab, you have to take a pill or you push a switch, and all of your systemic biases go away.
So here's two things that I like about that go with what you said. First, I personally like all my studies to be done in the field rather than in the lab because of that. So the study we did, the AMC theater, was exactly because of that, because I feel people in the lab are already in lab mode. They're kind of in what I call a little bit of lying mode because they already are monitored and they always try to trick to find what's the trick, what am I being tested for? So it's much more natural for scientists, I think, to grab you at the supermarket, in the business world, at the theater, and kind of find you when you're mostly natural and see how you behave, and then study your brain and study your behavior there. And then you can infer, when the person is in other places, how similar they are when they're in the lab to this thing. That's one step. But here's the more interesting moment where I think you're more truthful, when you're sleeping. So I think that there is one time in the day, a third of our life, where we actually shut down a lot of our, those people in the brain are kind of going to sleep. Some stay up. And whatever we do then is the output of some parts of our brain that are not always speaking. And they're different than who you speak with. So then you're a lot less likely to lie. So if we can actually look at your brain when you're sleeping, we get a lot more raw access to who you are. So most of our studies right now are done with people that are sleeping. So we bring it to the lab, we ask you to do something before, then we ask you to go to sleep. And because you have electrodes in your brain, we can start talking to your brain with you asleep, and then you're lying a lot less. Because, or if you're lying, it's now a really interesting lie, because it's a lie that you're telling yourself all the time to protect something. And now it's becoming an interesting moment. We can actually navigate your dreams or navigate your sleep in a way that reflects something that is very indirect. And that's, to me, the highest level of truthfulness, your brain without you stopping me from anything.
I have a few questions from Twitter and the audience. Dan Novi asks, does mastery of a skill shorten the gap between the neural spike and the perception of decision?
So mastery of skill does a few things, and it mostly replaces the location. So when we put electrodes in the brain of people, we basically put electrodes there based on the problem they have. So we don't really, so the surgeon first decides where to put the electrodes based on the problem, and then we come and we study whatever we can find. Mastery of skills usually moves information from that part to a different part. So when I think about the Cerf, I'm doing that, when I play a Cerf, I'm doing it from one part of my brain, the motor area, and as soon as I make myself think about how I do that, I move it to where I'm sitting as a doctor, looking at electrodes, and usually mastery of skills moves that way. So if a person is a master, we actually lose all of our studies because they just do it automatically without having any thought. So a good chess player plays from a part of the brain that I cannot access because it's outside of where I'm putting my electrodes, so we lose all the time.
Interesting. And Shasha is asking, how do you train yourself to tune into what the body is saying? I mean,
so that's an interesting thing. So part of the work that we do right now is working people on doing better. So this is mostly people in the business school who actually want to apply this work to do something better. So what we do is we have them, we hook their brain to a machine. This time it's outside, it's EEG, and we tell them basically walk for the next week with this machine over your head and do what you do normally, but also keep a diary. So the person basically says, okay, I'm going to my office, I'm making a choice to talk to this person, but that person, I'm doing my email, and they kind of keep a diary of their activity, but we also look at their brain. At the end of the week, we look at their brain and their diary, and we ask them what choices that you made you are happy with, which ones are you not happy with. What we see is that for every brain, we can actually characterize the manifestation of activity that corresponds to things that the person is happy with and not. So here's an example. Some of you might be better in making decisions in the morning, some in the evening. Some after lunch, some before lunch. Some after you talk to a lot of people, some when you talk to yourself. Some when you're angry, some when you're not. So we can actually look at your week by looking at your brain and your also diary, and you tell us which choices you made you're happy with, and we look at how your brain was when you made those choices, and we can tell you, okay, you are a person that needs to decide only after you talk to your wife at 8 a.m. and not talk to anyone else. And you might be the opposite. So for every person, there's its own brain decision-making pattern. We basically have you work for a week with this machine, learn how your brain looks, and then craft the best you for yourself. So you train about that.
So another question, and I'll add a little bit to it, but how long will it be until this technology is mature, cheap enough for individual people to hack their own minds? And I think related to that is how much difference is there on the sort of non-invasive stuff that you do versus the invasive stuff? I mean, is the fidelity different enough that one works much better?
Okay, so first of all, if you looked at 2010, when the dream recording machine story came up, one of the things that happened quickly is that a lot of companies called me and said, we want to option this thing. And I said, it's a lie, it doesn't exist. He said, no, never mind, as soon as you make it, we want to have it. So if you ask companies, you'll see that some companies already bought the non-existing dream recording machine that we have. So that's kind of how fast they work. In reality, I think that I'm not a fan of surgeries as a tool to learn about the brain. So it's the most immediate and best way to learn about the brain. You actually open it and you put electrodes inside, but it's not something that you can all use tomorrow. Not everyone is going to volunteer their brain for surgery. So what I hope is that we can replace everything with a non-invasive, cheap thing. And in a way, I hope that we're going to not need the brain for that. So if we can learn about your choices by looking at your eyes or skin conductance or a watch that you carry on you or a camera that looks at you, that's better. So the brain is a tool to get us access to things that you yourself cannot tell us. But if there's any other way to do that, I prefer that. So I'm a neuroscientist who basically prefers not neuroscience for anything. And that's not a good career thing, but it's actually a really good thing for the future, to have a lot of machines that provide the answers for you.
And you teach filmmaking, right?
Yeah.
And so is that, it's starting to make sense now because I saw it on the resume, but it's because understanding how the brain works helps you deliver and communicate.
I love stories. So generally, I think that the best way to communicate is by a story. I think that when I prepare a talk, I try to think on the anchor's story. I try to think, okay, should I wear a t-shirt? What should be like the thing that are going to go to the brain? Because all of our studies about engagement show that stories are the only thing, those are the moments of the peak of engagement. So when Obama gives a speech or instead of union address, you can see that there's a peak of engagement in the brain of people when he says, let me tell you a story about that person. When he says, I have a secret to tell you, people get engaged. So I believe in stories. I personally think that it's a craft that scientists and communicators need to have because it's really useful to communicate messages by knowing what story is matching your story. Personally, I lived in Los Angeles before I started, when I was a grad student, and I was exposed to a lot of filmmakers who, A, have great ideas. They have those science fiction ideas of tomorrow that I think are going to just become the next science research that we're going to do, and they're really good in finding out the story. So they have something that's magical about them. They can sit there in their room with a typewriter and write a script, and somehow their brain taps into the brain of millions of people out there, and they kind of know that if they just do it this way, everyone is going to be at the peak of engagement. And it's just them in the room. So it's the same as Picasso. He just throws a stroke of the brush, and he knows that by doing that, somehow every person that's going to come to the museum 100 years later is going to actually feel something when they see that. So this is like a skill that I think that I'm wondering about. It's like, how does a person sit in their office and somehow project his brain to everyone's brain and knows what's the average of all their brains and feel them. I think to me this is fascinating.
I actually have a theory on that because I worked in Hollywood and worked on a lot of scripts. And there are two categories of producers that I find are successful. They're either people with very ordinary sense of humor, so their brain actually is a model of everybody's brain, and there are people who are smart enough to be able to model it consciously. But the in-between fails. The people who are relatively smart but abnormal, they can't model the brain, and they are not the brain, and they make movies that just don't fit. And so those were the two categories of people that I know. So like J.J. Abrams has some really interesting ordinary pieces of him, but he's very smart, so he's able to project. And then there's other people who I won't name because this will be kind of insulting, who are just very ordinary, and you wonder why they're so good, but then you realize they're the ordinary people represented who are watching the show. That's my opinion.
So a step in the direction for me would be, is there a way to actually look at a person's brain when they go to the casting and looking at the brain and they're going to see, okay, you have this unusual brain. The same way we do with athletes right now. We try to look at 5-year-old kids, look at their brain and see, you have the brain of a master self-control. You should go to sports because you're going to be the athlete. Can we figure out, like, is it a skill that you learn? Are you born with? Like, it's basically, what is genius in the brain? To me, this is like an interesting question that now I want to find the half that you know that are J.J. Abrams and like scan their brain and see if you can see if they are somehow able to write a script and immediately tap into the brain of everyone else. Picasso, Einstein, you, J.J. Abrams, people that kind of see the world this way, I want to look at their brain and see how it works.
So I think that'll be an interesting thing to collect, sort of, and this gets back to the point of when are these tools going to become available. I think that's an interesting, in addition to gene sequencing and brain analysis, right?
So I think production-wise, the prices are going down easily. So we're out there in an ability to provide it for everyone. Knowledge-wise, how to operate it is a secondary problem, but mostly it's still a problem of the world not being ready for that. So I think that we're still afraid. And the idea of like mind reading, and it's still something that people are not interested in. So even if I give you a tool that you can put in your head and it's easy to operate and such, people are still not there.
And I think that the thing that just I would add and get your opinion on this is that you talked about a lot of the things that we successfully understand about the brain, but there are so many things that we don't understand about the brain. I mean, I was talking to Sebastian Song, who said we don't even know how our eyes track moving objects, right? So there's so much function in the brain that we don't yet understand. So just because we can see when you like Bart Simpson doesn't necessarily mean that we understand how it works, right?
Yeah. I think that we're getting in a way farther and farther. So the more we understand about the Simpsons, we just get exposed to all kinds of things we don't know, and suddenly things don't add up. So your Bart Simpson cell sits next to cells that code for other things that are not at all cartoons or not at all interesting, or not at all. And when we try to figure out what's the mapping, we have no idea. And before, 10 years ago, when we didn't find those Barrett-Simpson cells, we just assumed that memory is all in one location. Now we found them, and we learned that memory is also distributed in a way that's messy. So now we know that we didn't know. So we only know more things we don't know. So we're just getting farther.
Because we had a conversation a couple months ago where we were talking about the gut biome. And a lot of the interesting recent research around fecal microbiome transplants, where you actually transplant personality together with the microbiome, and the extent to which the microbes in your gut control things like personality and what you do and things like that. So it's also interesting how much isn't actually in the brain, right?
So there's a study that came out a few weeks ago that I love about basically bacteria. And it goes the following way. So I go to your office, and so they did it is they bring people to the lab, and a person comes and they shake their hands and say, welcome to the lab, wait a few minutes, we're going to bring the experimenter in a second, and they're going to talk to you about whatever happens. And basically, in the 5 minutes that you're waiting for the experimenter, everyone at some point did something like this. So they smelled the hand that they were shaking. So in a way, this is like a suggestion of what is handshake. So handshake, according to this study, is a way for me to kind of transfer some of my bacteria to you. I leave it with you and I go away, and now in the course of 5 minutes, you're somehow going to smell it to kind of get the pheromone and see if my immune system is working. And actually, they did all kinds of versions. So they did it one time I shake your hand with a glove, then you don't do anything, you don't smell it. If it's a female versus a male, you smell it faster versus male. So they did all kinds of studies. And what's behind that is basically you and I have all kinds of bacteria on us. And we share it a little bit, and then you smell it and to see if it's matching yours and if you like it a lot. Which means that not only am I not choosing you when I make this experiment actually it's my bacteria choosing your bacteria.
Yes.
That's a level of intimacy that we have. Like my bacteria and your bacteria are kind of mixed and say, okay, I think we like each other. Let's mate. Yeah. That's about like the level of complexity that we have right now.
So the free will may just be coming from our bacteria.
Exactly. That's all that there is.
and then. Another one is from Dan. Do we see the same reduction of self-deception during altered states of consciousness that we do chemically similar to sleep?
So in sleep, sleep is an interesting phenomena, specifically dreams. So dreams is like a short period in your sleep where you're watching a movie that your brain plays at you. And the question is, why this movie? What does it mean? I mean, Freud's been looking at it for 100 years. So it's a question. And the interesting question on that dimension is, like, if I spend all my life lying to myself, let's say I'm in a situation where I don't want to be, and I tell myself I love this job even though I hate this job, or I really want to do this even though I don't like it at all, I spend all the time lying to myself. What's going to be the movie that I'm going to see when I'm asleep? And the early suggestion was that in my dreams I'm going to see the opposite. I'm going to actually, I don't like this thing that I'm doing, but in my sleep it's going to show a movie. And what we see right now is it's not the case. What we see when we put electrodes in the brain and we see the movies, it turns out that what happens in the movie in your dream is a lot more complex. What happens is actually that you play out different futures to get out of the situation. So let's say I have I'm not sure if I should marry Lisa or Leslie, and I'm really baffled by that. It's kind of troubling me. In my sleep, I play a movie of me marrying Lisa, and my body actually responds to the movie as if it's real life. So it kind of sees how it feels, and it sees if the heart rate goes up when I spend time with her, and it says a lot of things. Then I go back, and then in my next cycle, I'm going to play out the entire movie with me marrying Leslie, and my body is again going to respond to that. And at the end of that, my body kind of wakes up in the morning and says, okay, I experienced both, simulated both futures. It seems that this one is better for me. And you actually wake up with an answer. So one of the leading hypotheses right now about dreams is it's a way for our brain to play scenarios of the future for us, so we can actually wake up with an answer, which means that sometimes when you have a dilemma, you actually go to sleep and wake up with an answer. That's kind of, and the movies seem to correspond with the things that you want to know. So this is a ultimate type of deception. Like, we basically don't know the answer. We let our brain play out a lie to ourselves, nothing that doesn't exist, so we wake up with an answer. So we actually know, using the lies, what's right for us. That's like a beautiful way to look at dreams.
Thank you. And we're just out of time, but that was really wonderful. Thank you, Moran.
Thank you.